If you've ever said, I'm fine, and known in that exact moment you said it, that it was a lie, this video is for you. I got really good at fine, like Olympic level fine. Fine at work, fine with family, fine when people ask how things were going. Fine, fine, fine. And here's what I figured out about fine. It's not neutral. Fine is a performance, and performances are exhausting, especially when you're the only one in the audience who knows it's fake. So today I'm sharing 8 things I'm doing to stop. Not things I read about, not framework, what actually happened, the real version, not the polished one. Some of it was small and some of it was uncomfortable in ways that I didn't expect. And all of it was worth it. Let's get into it. The first thing I did was stop explaining myself. And I know that sounds simple, but think about how much energy we burn pre-justifying our choices to people who never actually. I used to do this constantly. Someone would ask a completely neutral question like, oh, you're not doing that anymore? And I would immediately launch into a 3-paragraph defense of my decision. Why I made it, why it made sense, why it wasn't as bad as it might look. Nobody asked for any of that. I just couldn't tolerate the idea that someone might be silently judging me. Here's what I realized. The explanation is the performance. Is how we manage other people's discomfort with our choices, except we're usually managing discomfort they didn't even have. When I stopped doing it, when I just said, yeah, I changed directions and left it right there, the silence was uncomfortable for just maybe 4 seconds. And then nothing happened because there was nothing there to manage to begin with. Most of the judgment I was defending against lived entirely in my head. Thing 2, I admitted what I actually wanted out loud to another person. This one was harder than I expected. I had been thinking about what I wanted for a long time, writing about it, journaling it, turning it over and over in my head at 2 in the morning, but I had never actually said it out loud to another human being. And I want to be clear, I'm not talking about announcements and telling all your business. I'm not talking about your plan and letting everybody know. I'm talking about one sentence to like one person, because what I found is saying it in your head, it keeps it theoretical, but saying it out loud, it made it real. And real means it's actually mine. It's not just a fantasy. The minute I said what I actually wanted, not what seemed reasonable, not what I thought I could justify, what I actually wanted, I felt differently. It felt terrifying before I said it. And then I said it and the person across from me, they didn't laugh. They didn't tell me I was being unrealistic. They didn't give me the reaction I'd been bracing for. They just said, okay, so what's stopping you? And I didn't have a good answer. So a lot of fine, it lives in the gap between what we want and what we're willing to admit we want. Thing 3, I looked at my actual numbers instead of guessing. This one is specific and I'm going to be direct about it. Part of how I maintained fine for so long was financial vagueness. Not looking at the full picture, not tracking what was coming in across everything I was doing. I was telling myself it would probably work out without actually checking whether it would. And I want to say something about that. Not knowing felt like protection. If I didn't look, I couldn't be disappointed. I couldn't see how close to the edge I really was. I couldn't be confronted with a number that made me have to make a decision. But what not knowing actually was paralysis, because you cannot make a real decision about your career, about a pivot, about anything when you're working from a story you've told yourself instead of what's actually true. So I sat down and I looked, what am I actually making? What's actually going out? What does this picture really look like? And yeah, some of it was uncomfortable, if I'm being honest, but it was also clarifying in a way that the vagueness never was. Because once I could see it clearly, I could actually do something about it. This is actually why I built Stack Tracker, because I needed something simple that would show me my full picture across all income streams without requiring a finance degree to use. And if you're in the same place I was, I'll link it below. It's not complicated. It just shows you what's real. Thing 4, I let some things be unfinished and I didn't apologize for it, which is, it kind of goes against the next video I have, but I'll explain. Find people finish things, or at least they perform finishing things. I had a project I had been dragging behind me for months. Something that I had started with real energy, and then the energy ran out, and then I felt guilty about the energy running out. And then I started avoiding the whole thing because it reminded me of the guilt. And one day I just set it down. I just stopped. And here's what surprised me. The relief, it was immediate. Not because quitting felt good. It didn't exactly. But because I got back all of that energy that I had been spending on dragging it. We carry unfinished things like they're evidence of something, or like if we could just push through and finish them, we prove that we're not the kind of person who gives up, right? But some things were started by a version of us that we've since outgrown. And the most honest thing we can do is acknowledge that and set it down. Not everything we started needs to be finished. Most do, but not everything. And that's not failure, that is discernment. Thing 5, I stopped performing competence in spaces where I felt lost. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being in a room or a conversation or a situation where you have no idea what's happening and you're nodding, like you do. I spent years doing that. And it felt like a performance, performing fluency in areas where I was genuinely a beginner and asking smart sounding questions instead of the questions I actually needed to ask. And I was staying in my head, crafting my next sentence instead of just admitting I needed someone to back up and explain. What changed was I started saying, hey, I'm still figuring this out and I want to tell you. Nobody pulled my badge when I did. Nobody looked at me differently in the way that I was afraid of. The people who respected me more for it. And the ones who needed me to perform, I realized that I didn't actually need their version of respect. There's something about admitting that you're learning that creates trust instead of destroying it. Because everyone in that room is also figuring something out. And when just one person drops the performance, it gives everyone else a little room to breathe. Thing 6, I gave myself the actual truth instead of the highlight reel. This is about the stories we tell ourselves. We're so practiced at the highlight reel, the version of our situations that not technically are a lie, but it's definitely curated, right? And we start believing it ourselves. I started doing something small and kind of uncomfortable to get around that. I would just write down 3 things that were actually true about where I was. Not the worst case and not the spin, just something in between. Not the everything happens for a reason version. What was actually real? And I know that sounds like it could be demoralizing, but it wasn't. It was actually the opposite, because when you're working from a curated story, you're always slightly off balance. You're managing the gap between the story and reality, and that gap takes energy that we don't have. When I started seeing things clearly, like really clearly, I could actually respond to what was real instead of managing a narrative. Seeing your situation honestly is not the same as feeling hopeless. Clear-eyed is not the same as defeated. In fact, for me, clarity was the first time in a long time that I felt like I was actually standing on something solid. If any of this is resonating, if you're recognizing yourself somewhere in this list, I want to hear which one hits closest for you right now. Drop it in the comments. And if thing 3, the numbers, the finance picture is where you're stuck, Stack Tracker is in the link below. That's exactly what I built it for. It's not complicated, it's just clear. Thing 7, I let more of my relationships get real instead of keeping it surface, because fine sometimes is a social contract. At times we all agree to perform, nobody asks too many questions, and we all get to keep our comfortable distance. It works until it doesn't. So I picked a group of people, and I want to be clear about what this looks like. It wasn't a confessional or emotional dumping on people. It was just honest conversations where we stopped doing the I'm fine thing or the good version and said something closer to where we actually were. And what I found was we were all relieved, because we had been performing a little bit, and we don't have to dismantle every relationship that we have, but we do need to come radically vulnerable sometimes with some people. We don't have to dismantle all of our relationships, and we don't have to become radically vulnerable with everyone in our circle, but we just need a few people where we don't have to perform, like a small group, maybe just one person, where they get the real version of you. In those conversations, it changed the texture of everything around us. Not because we fixed anything, just because we stopped pretending. Thing 8, I started treating my life like it was worth tracking. This last one thing is I started paying attention to what was actually happening. And what I mean by this is I started noting things, not obsessive, not in a complicated system, just tracking my decisions, my experiments, what was working, what wasn't, where I was putting my energy, and what I was producing. Fine people don't track, because tracking means looking at things, and looking means seeing it, and seeing it means You have to respond. But here's what tracking gave me that performing fine never could. It gave me evidence that I was moving in some direction, even when it felt like I was standing still at times. Evidence that things were changing, even when it was slow. It was evidence that I was making decisions instead of just reacting to whatever showed up. This channel is part of that for me. Showing up every week and saying, here I am, here's what's happening. That's tracking in public. It's the opposite of fine. And it's honest, and it turns out it's a lot lighter for me to carry. Fine protected us for a long time. And I'm not gonna sit here and tell you that I was wrong for doing it and that it'll never happen again, because habits are hard to break. But it did what it needed to do. And there's a point where fine stops being protection and starts being a cage. Maintaining the performance costs more than it gives back. And the exhaustion of pretending, it outweighs whatever we were afraid of and whatever could happen if we stop. The 8 things I did aren't heroic. They weren't dramatic. They were just honest, and honest is enough to start with. The question I'll leave you with is this: what would you actually do? What decision would you actually make? What move would you take if you stopped pretending you were fine with where you are right now? I'll see you on the next one.